I'm Dr. Richard Carr, Senior Lecturer in History and Politics at Anglia Ruskin University and author of the new book March of the Moderates. Despite ground that was in some ways opportune, we've just experienced a decade where the British left has been miles from actual power. Though James Bloodworth has ably illustrated the realities of low-paid Britain and Lisa Nandy the plight of left-behind towns, the reality has been that too few trust Labour to do anything effective about these problems. Calls for nationalisation have not worked in the age of Netflix. Palestine and Venezuela have not proven issues that have ignited huge swathes of support. And when it comes to putting their cross on the ballot paper, voters don't seem to care about performative issues like which school Tory leaders went to. Latterly then, Labour has been wedded to its old ideological comfort blankets. Everything is unfair, the media is rigged, America is the devil. Self-evidently, you don't win elections from here. As the New Statesman's Stephen Bush has observed, the left often has to play politics on difficult mode. The key, however, is to not make things even harder for yourself. In my book analysing what I dub the March of the Moderates, I show how Labour has been here before and how it got out of this rabbit hole. In the 1980s, on both sides of the Atlantic and indeed the European continent, centre-left politicians and thinkers alike sought to rescue progressive parties from the claws of ideological zealots determined to drive them into the abyss. Thanks to the work of Diane Hayter, John Goulding and others, some of the British stories here we know well. Neil Kinnock heroically took on militants and launched a policy review that reoriented Labour away from some of its more eccentric proposals. Tony Blair and Gordon Brown ably supported him in doing so. Meanwhile, Labour in local government was creative and brave on issues like gay rights. But as I show, a big part of the March of the Moderates was also the international dialogue between transatlantic figures fighting the self-same battles. After all, the Democrats were being thrashed by Ronald Reagan and Labour by Margaret Thatcher, so there was much to discuss for those hoping to get progressives back into power in the US and UK. With the right's offer of tax cuts, privatisation and its muscular defence policy proving much more electable than the left's combination of big government and diplomatic pacifism, there needed to be a new project, what became known, through the work of Tony Giddens, as the Third Way. Beginning with policy wonks like Elaine Kamarck and Al From the mid-1980s, moderate US Democrats started to tease out a new policy agenda. They formed new bodies like Will Marshall's Progressive Policy Institute and Al From's Democratic Leadership Council, the DLC. The latter would have the specific aim of making sure the party gained an electable candidate, eventually achieved through an Arkansas governor who had balanced the budget, taken on public sector interest, and brought back the death penalty to his state, the 1992 Democratic nominee, William Jefferson Clinton. But before they could achieve this, groups like the DLC had to tell some hard truths to the left. As they noted, in the minds of too many Americans, the Democratic Party has stood for government programs that don't work, special interests before the interests of ordinary people, and a reluctance to assert American values at home and abroad. Instead, for such types, the mission of government should be to expand opportunity, not bureaucracy. Rather than decrying capitalism altogether then, such figures argued for a new social compact to make our free enterprise system more democratic and productive. This was a positive new agenda which sought to grow the economy and reinvest the proceeds into socially progressive ends. Better schools, healthcare, and rewarding work for the low-paid. Its leading figures understood the recent history of their parties. Gordon Brown was, after all, a historian by training, whilst Bill Clinton had seen the protests against the Vietnam War firsthand. But such figures also knew they could not be imprisoned by their party's history. Crucially then, theirs was a new agenda forged mainly by listening to what the electorate was actually saying, not what party bigwigs or their allies wanted to hear. To do so, their method was the same. While Stan Greenberg took the pulse of voters in areas like Macomb County, Michigan, Philip Gould and Deborah Mattinson were doing the same thing in the UK. Their focus groups, often later derided, provided a stark illustration of voters' true feelings towards the left. As one Southern English voter told Gould, "I'm not going to vote Labour to get a job for someone in Newcastle. You could either engage with that individualism or keep banging the collectivist drum and keep losing." As well as a similar modus operandi, this agenda was forged by an Atlanticist set of personalities who knew each other's countries well. Bill Clinton had spent the late 1960s at Oxford and found the food at its covered market the closest thing to good old Southern cooking, whilst Ed Ball studied at Harvard and enjoyed a burger or two at Charlie's Kitchen in Boston. Yvette Cooper put in the hard yards working for Bill Clinton in 1992, all the while surviving on a less than inspiring diet of baked potatoes, sweet corn and bananas from a local farm. Meanwhile, from the Senate, Joe Biden loved Neil Kinnock's oratory so much that he famously borrowed text from his speeches almost verbatim. From Labour's Treasury team, Gordon Brown loved to holiday in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, bought his best shirts at Brooks Brothers in New York, and devoured DLC pamphlets whenever the opportunity arose. As well as a common agenda and a common history, however, the Third Way was lastly blessed by some uniquely talented figures. Bill Clinton was a once-in-a-generation communicator whose charm and brain were immeasurable. Tony Blair was an agile figure with a sharp legal mind, which made sure he could drive home the modernisation agenda that Neil Kinnock and John Smith had started, and who was a genuine radical who, at times, barely seemed to like aspects of the Labour Party and the trade union movement at all. To many British voters, this was an asset and not a criticism. After dining with him in 1993, Stan Greenberg found Tony Blair like a Bill Clinton, but without all the complexity. In the 1990s, this was as close to political catnip as it was possible to get. Now, we should be clear, nobody is calling for an exact return to this era, and moderates need to be as careful as the hard left from seeking an unthinking return to a world that is gone. Replicating 1994 in 2024 simply won't wash. But that world still offers broad lessons about tone and the big picture. Things got better under Blair and Clinton. A new national minimum wage and record investment in schools and hospitals under New Labour, eliminating the deficit, gun control, and a landmark increase in the earned income tax credit under the New Democrats. Genocidal dictators overthrown, successive elections won. And until progressives are prepared to defend their last terms in office, Blair, Brown, Clinton, and indeed Obama, and understand how hard it was to win this power, why, voters may well ask, should anyone give them another go at government? For more information, read my book March of the Moderates, which shows how Bill Clinton and Tony Blair shaped the politics of a generation.